The only thing more difficult than raising a human from the dead is raising a motorcycle company from the dead. I'm pretty sure that's somewhere in the Bible. Many motorcyclists don't realize that there are motorcycle companies out there walking and living among us that were once completely dead. Some of these are well-known companies selling loads of different types of motorcycles, and others are smaller, lesser-known brands just sort of trying to make it. But all of them have amazing histories that sometimes go all the way back to the very beginning of two-wheeled vehicles. So without further ado, let's jump in and look at some motorcycle companies that came back from the grave. All right, first on our list, of course, we can't talk about this without talking about Triumph. And I'm guessing many of you know that Triumph has a long history of making incredible, even legendary motorcycles. Triumph's peak as a company came in the 1960s when it was setting record sales worldwide and making the baddest looking motorcycles on the planet. But their demise, along with some of the other companies that we're going to look at, came at the hands of Japanese influence, and they ultimately went bankrupt in 1983, though they were pretty much done, in the 70s. The Triumph that we know and sometimes love today really started to create and release motorcycles in the early 90s, first with this thing, which is the Triumph Trophy. Not the greatest motorcycle of all time, certainly not the prettiest, but like the old Triumph, this new Triumph that we see is tenacious, they're innovative, they make incredible motorcycles. They really found their niche making performance-oriented, stylish motorcycles that feel thoroughly British, and that's really what they are today. Now, there is no real leftover DNA from the old company in the new Triumph. It's an entirely new company. As much as they tout, this history, it's a different history. It's two different companies, technically. The Bonnevilles of today have literally nothing to do with the Bonnevilles of the 60s, besides the incredible copy of design. And at some point, I'd like to talk about how motorcycle companies do sort of fake the idea of heritage. And, we can do that in another video, but for sure it's present in a lot of these companies that have been dead and were reborn, and I don't blame them for that at all. But yeah, it's a thing. Okay, number 7 on our list is Indian. Now, Indian is different than Triumph in the sense that Triumph wasn't entirely dead for very long, whereas Indian went under as a company way back in the 1950s and was revived officially in a really meaningful way, like in the mid-2000s, and especially when Polaris took over and started producing basically what we know of now in terms of motorcycles. Now, you should know that many of these brands, and especially Indian, still had periods of ownership and even attempts at revival through those years between their original death as a company or bankruptcy and today's successful attempt at actually restarting the company. And some of these brands did produce some pretty rare, cool machines, but for Indian, again, it's all about what happened with Polaris that has made Indian a modern force in the motorcycling industry, and especially as a competitor to Harley. Indian has really latched onto that sort of heritage as an American brand making American motorcycles, and I think it's a fresh sort of thing to have in the market, to have an American company making really cool machines. Sure, they make a lot of cruisers that feel like copies of Harley, but there's a lot of things that they do better than Harley, and yeah, it's pretty cool. Indian's a really cool company. Now, the last American brand that we're going to talk about on our list goes to Buell, and this one's a bit different than the last two in the sense that it hasn't experienced anything close to its former glory in terms of sales. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire Buell story, not only because we don't have time, but also because I don't feel like I have a fully adequate grasp on what actually happened. I mean, I know what happened, but I don't know why all of it happened. Regardless, Eric Buell's ventures as an American innovator in the motorcycle world have been nothing short of interesting, to say the least. Now, I had heard that Buell was going to be making electric motorcycles, but it appears as though they're currently working on sport bikes, primarily regular combustion sport bikes. And they do also have this stretched 185 horsepower dirt bike thing. That is insane when you think about it. A dirt bike that has 185 horsepower. Regardless, I'm not totally sure where Buell is headed, if this will actually all be successful, as I'm sure these bikes are incredibly expensive. And sadly, as impressive as 185 horsepower sounds, it's not really in the realm of modern super bikes being made by Japanese and Italian manufacturers. So, for whatever the price is going to be, I'm sure you'd probably be better off getting, a Ducati or something like that. And it's going to be more powerful and obviously more reliable. But hey, Buell is an American company. It's really cool that they make American sport bikes. And yeah, I think people want American sport bikes. All that aside, Buell's a pretty interesting story, and they're technically a company that has been revived. All right, next up we have Benelli, which if you don't know a whole lot about the history of Italian motorcycle manufacturers, you might just think Benelli is like a Chinese company making cheap sort of knockoff motorcycles. But Benelli is still technically an Italian company. They are currently owned by a Chinese motorcycling group, but I will say from everything I've seen, Benelli is making some of the most interesting motorcycles that are in any way associated with China, and I think it's smart of this motorcycling group in China. I don't know how to say the name, Quanjiang. I'm not sure how to say it. But I do think it's smart of them to pick up this company because they're making affordable Italian bikes basically, and they look pretty cool. And that's because Benelli has retained that Italian flavor, maybe not to the level of our next company that we're going to talk about, but it is there. And like so many other companies, when the Japanese brands took over, Benelli basically died in the 70s and was revived again in the late 90s. Seems like the late 90s and the early 2000s was really the time to revive a motorcycle company. I don't know why, but that's kind of when it happened for so many companies. There were some really cool, valuable motorcycles produced during this time, and eventually Benelli would join the Chinese motorcycle group that we mentioned above. And they're more affordable, they're pretty cool, but the really rare, interesting bikes that they made were in the early 2000s before they joined that group. All right, next up we have MV Agusta, the boutique Italian manufacturer making some of the craziest motorcycles that money can buy. MV Agusta found their start in motorcycles back in the 1940s in Italy, and most of their early motorcycles were actually quite utilitarian. They were smaller capacity bikes, a lot of scooters, but there was always a flavor of invention. I have a really interesting book that sort of goes through the history of MV Agusta, and even in their early years, they were just trying out crazy things and making motorcycles that would never see the light of day, that they would never actually sell, just trying to make different stuff. MV had some incredible machines up until the 70s when they ceased production, but what stands out more than anything is their pedigree in racing, with their bikes being ridden by some of the greatest Grand Prix racers of all time, including Giacomo Agostini and Mike Halewood, and MV still stands up next to the giants of MotoGP racing history despite its demise in the 70s and having never returned to official Grand Prix racing. Now, MV was revived in the 90s by the great Castiglione brothers and would ultimately return to racing, though not on the GP stage. MV Agusta has had many ups and downs since its revival as a company, but I think it's safe to say that MV Agusta is probably, as a company, in the best position it's been since its revival. It seems like it's in a much better place than before. But a lot of the really rare, cool MV Agustas that you can buy, besides the really old ones, are from those early years, from 99 to about 2005. Now this one I'm guessing you probably have not heard much about, as they're currently making small capacity motorcycles in small numbers, but AJS, which is the legendary British motorcycle manufacturer known for its record-breaking engines of the early 1900s and into the 30s, though their name was used still on engines all the way up into the 70s, I believe, this company itself wasn't making motorcycles after the 30s, and again, like so many other companies, they were revived in the 90s, and currently AJS offers some of the most thoroughly British looking motorcycles available. These are super cool, cafe racer style retro bikes, and honestly, they look better than most of the competition. Now they are smaller capacity 125cc machines, but hey, who needs cc's anyways? They produce about the same power as a Grom, and they don't really cost much more, and in my opinion, they're way cooler. So definitely worth checking out. They look pretty awesome. All right, number 2 on our list goes to Brough Superior, again, a legendary British company that ceased production of motorcycles way back at the beginning of World War II, known for making high-end, fast, sort of luxury grand tour motorcycles. Brough Superior is known for making one of the greatest bikes of all time, at least the greatest British bikes of all time, in contention with the Vincent Black Shadow. It's kind of between them. Now, the Brough Superior name was purchased a few years back, and they are now producing limited edition motorcycles that truly do carry on the tradition, not just generally of making fast sort of luxury bikes powered by stylish V-twins, but also the specific design elements really do harken back to the old Brough Superiors in a way that is really hard not to like. I mean, they're pretty cool looking. Yes, they are expensive, and it might be a while before we see like large-scale production versions of these bikes, but hey, this is how MV Agusta got started again in the 90s. This is a viable path for motorcycle companies. It's a viable path for any automobile companies to just make something rare, limited, and expensive to sort of fund the ability to make, more bikes for the general population. Now, perhaps the most tumultuous revivals of all goes to the legendary company Norton, the British motorcycle company that goes all the way back to the very beginning of motorcycle manufacturing, all the way up to the legendary Norton Commando of the 70s, from innovative frame designs to deal with vibrations, the racing pedigree. Norton really had it all, and like Triumph, they lost it all, primarily because of the Japanese invasion of the 70s and because of laziness. That's really the gist of it for these British companies. Well, I guess it's also just like an unwillingness to change. Definitely that too. Norton carried on with Triumph, and some weird motorcycles were made during that time, but what's really interesting for our purpose is the revival, which has really been an ongoing and rather crazy endeavor for years. Norton was purchased for a really cheap price. I don't know the exact number. I've seen a bunch of different numbers in looking at this, but it's not very much. But the biggest story was the pension fraud of Stuart Garner, which you can read all about in the article that I'll link below. There's also a really great podcast with the current manager of Norton that I will also link below. And honestly, Norton appears to be in a good place now currently under the Indian firm TVS Motor. I would love to see Norton blow up and become a legit manufacturer, a legitimate British contender to Triumph. I think they make really cool motorcycles. They have the ability to make sport bikes. They could make anything, it seems like. So yeah, I'm really excited about Norton's future. The moral of the story is this: it's incredibly difficult to get a motorcycle company off the ground. It takes millions and millions of dollars, perhaps around 100 million, to really do it successfully. And even then, there's loads of motorcycle companies that have failed even with that kind of money. So it's not an easy endeavor, and I really think it's important to recognize what many of these brands have done in reviving old classic motorcycle brands. As much as I hate how much these companies do talk about heritage and DNA from the past, I do understand why they do it. That's why they bought the company in the first place. It's the name, it's the heritage. It makes sense. But yeah, let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. Do you trust these brands? Or do you like to go for motorcycle companies that have never died, that have just been doing their thing since they started? All right, hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.